Hi, this is Starkey Sowers, Director of Education for Clark's Nutrition and Natural Foods Market. Welcome again to another Plus Program training series. Today's topic, herbs, part one. So real quick, these are series that we actually developed for you guys, kind of gives you a little bit of a behind the scenes look, so to speak, at what we do with our staff and some of the training processes that we have with our staff. And today's topic being herbs is definitely one of my favorite topics, but I think it's kind of important for us to clear up and maybe understand what herbs are all about. First of all, when we look at herbs, it's a little bit different depending on the profession. So if you're a botanist, you might look at an herb and they'll typically say that anything that's roughly about knee height and down or 30 centimeters high is going to be an herb. So that's like some of the different types of shrubs that you might have around your garden. Well, when an herbalist looks at an herb, it's totally different. So when they look at it, they use any type of plant, vegetable, fruit part that they can get their hands on. So if we're looking at a tree, so to speak, they would use the flower, they would use the leaves, they would use the stems, they would use the bark, they would use the roots. They're going to use the whole thing, especially if it's going to accomplish anything when it comes to balancing the body back. So that kind of gives you a little bit of definition, some of the differences of it. So let's kind of start looking at maybe a little bit of a history on herbs. Well, we definitely have some references. We see some biblical references. Genesis 1:29, every herb bearing fruit seed is there for food. And so ultimately that was one of the original scriptures, so to speak, but at the same time, it's some of the first reference points that we see with herbs. Then we look at Egyptian times in 1500 BC, they were writing with papyrus and different types of scrolling systems in order to talk about herbs and a medical system they had developed. You look at the Ayurvedic system, roughly about 700 BC. You also look at Solomon, 950 BC. Solomon had 3,000 books on herbs. So there's all these different types of references that are there. It's really crucial. One of the most important things to remember, though, is roughly about 80% of the world's population in an indigenous system actually to this day still get treated using herbs and herbal systems. So that's kind of important. So let's take another peek real quick at maybe the herbs today and how we're looking at them in reference point to the United States. A little bit different. First of all, remember there's a holistic concept with herbs. The idea of a holistic concept is a little bit different here in the United States nowadays, especially the last maybe 15 years, and especially the last maybe 70 years. And so what's a holistic system? Well, a holistic system basically goes like this, where you're not only using a combination of herbs and also food systems and maybe spices, but you're also in a situation where you're using like meditation, prayer. You're also in a situation where you're doing exercise and maybe a massage, and all these things kind of equaling together to make your body back in balance. So this is a great idea. We see a lot of pieces of this, so to speak, here in the United States today, but that's kind of the herbalist view, using a bunch of different things together, not only with herbs and foods, but also some mechanical things such as exercise to kind of bring the body back into balance. All right, so typically one of the things that we run into in the United States is we have a tendency, and especially here in the United States, also in Europe, to kind of look at herbs kind of from a medicinal standpoint of view. We really kind of changed our views, especially in the last 20 years or so. We kind of want to use a little bit different framework, so to speak. And one of the reasons why we typically have a reason to do this is because of the way we actually view medicines. So roughly about 1930s to 1950s, we actually shifted from the use of herbs as a medical system to largely what we call medicines today. So how did they do that? Well, what they did is they started pushing, so to speak, on a lot of these different drug companies to take maybe white willow bark and find the active ingredient, which of course was salicylic acid, which is aspirin, and then chemically start to manufacture it, as opposed to being holistically found in the herb, which has some balancing agents, which makes it a little bit more effective, but maybe less dramatic on the system. So roughly about 1930s, there was about 300 to 400 different herbs in the United States pharmacopoeia. Today, there's probably about 3 or 4. And that's changing a little bit. There's also what we call an American Botanical Council, and they've kind of been adding back to that a little bit. But ultimately, we saw everything kind of get pushed into what we call the drug realm, so to speak. All right, so another system that we can look at, which is a real kind of a common system that we use, is what I call like a culinary system. Especially here in the United States, we have a tendency to really focus a lot of our attention on taste. And so when you look at taste, one of the things that you think about when it comes to herbs is more like spices and seasonings. Well, typically the English system had like an English garden, and some of the most common herbs that were typically used would be like chamomile, maybe ginger, as well as garlic. That might ring a bell, as well as black pepper, typically used in what we call a culinary system. Mind you, there's a lot of different types of herbs. Some of the most popular ones that we're seeing now, of course, curries. So it's a combination of turmeric and maybe some black pepper and some other things like cumin and things like that added together. But ultimately, that's what we call like a culinary herb or a cooking herb that's been typically used for centuries, obviously, for thousands of years. The other thing that we have a tendency to use a lot here in the United States would be teas. So green tea, black tea, chamomile teas. You think about it, the number one consumed beverage across the world is going to be water. Number two actually is green tea. You might have thought it was Coca-Cola, but it's not. It's definitely green tea. And black tea and peppermint tea have a tendency to fall in behind that. So you think about green tea, it's kind of like a tonic herb, and we'll talk a little bit about that in part 2. But what it does is kind of helps with energy. It's got a little bit of caffeine. It's also got theanine, which is an amino acid that kind of relaxes the body. So it's kind of like the perfect beverage to kind of get you up and help you stay mentally focused throughout the day. All right, so you might be thinking, well, that's kind of a nice history, but how are herbs used? So when we look at the next slide, what we're going to do is we're going to see kind of a couple different usage system and kind of like round out the series. So ultimately what happens here is probably the most common usage is going to be capsules and maybe a little bit of tablets, but most everything nowadays has gone to capsules. Probably second on the list is going to be herbal extracts, and herbal extracts are where you take the herb, like maybe a pound of it, and you mix it with like maybe a half a gallon of a combination of water and alcohol, let it soak roughly for about 20 to 30 days, and then you extract it out. And then ultimately what you'll end up with is what we call like a 1 ounce tincture, so to speak, or maybe 4 ounces out of that whole mixture. And what it does is it pulls out the active constituents. And those active constituents are something we're going to talk about in part 2. And those are the things that really make the herb work, so to speak. So some other different ways, obviously, liniments. Another typical thing would be like an elixir. I saw an elixir the other day, which actually was a beverage that had herbs added to it. And then probably the most popular thing that we're seeing now is aromatherapy, being one of the last things we're seeing an explosion, so to speak, with herbal use. So that kind of gives you an idea what herbs, where they come from, what they're all about. In the next series, what we'll do is kind of give you a little bit of insights on some of the most popular herbs and maybe some of the usages of those. This is Starkey Sowers, Director of Education for Clark's Nutrition and Natural Foods Market, reminding you to live better, we can help.